I believe that the most important thing we can talk about this day and time is the Christ, the Master. And you might ask me, then, why did you spend the week talking about Egypt, if you think that's so important? And I've asked myself that. Why did I study Egypt if I think the Christ is the thing that I am interested in and want to talk about? And this is the reason. Egypt, it says in these readings, is as a beginning, as a background, and the foundation of that taught by the Master 10,500 years later. The foundation of his teachings come from this period. And why that period? Because the world teachers who taught the oneness came together in Egypt and correlated their truths at 10,500 BC. And Jesus had an incarnation as Hermes, according to Hugh Lynn and many others, at that period, and was part of that whole scene, and correlated those teachings. Came back as a student to study in Egypt and Persia and India and other portions of the world, these correlations of truths, and took them as his basis for his teachings. So I think it's important for us to have a background, something about Atlantis and about Egypt at this period, in relation to understanding the times and the teachings of Jesus who became the Christ. And I say Jesus who became the Christ. Let me give you a definition of Christ from these readings. Christ consciousness is the awareness within each soul, imprinted in pattern on the mind, and waiting to be awakened by the will of the soul's oneness with God. Imprinted in each and every soul is this pattern of oneness. And when we, through right choices, through the practice of love, through the fruits of the Spirit, patience, kindness, gentleness, and all those, we awaken the awareness of this oneness that is there all the time, just waiting to become active. Jesus was able to awaken this pattern within himself, to demonstrate it in his life. He was the pattern, it says, but the Christ consciousness, which is in each and every soul, was the power. The awakening of that is the power. And he is a man, the pattern, our elder brother. We must follow his pattern. We too may do this as he did. So with that in mind, I think it's well that we study this period. I'd like to give you a little background about the preparation for this coming of this one into the earth to become the Christ by the Essenes. The word Essenes means expectancy. They were reading the promises in the scriptures about this one from Genesis the 3rd through Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament, about this one who was to come. And they expected it and lived as though they expected it to happen. A little background. It says Carmel, the school of the prophets, was established during Elijah's time, and they studied what would be called in the present astrology, numerology, phrenology, the bumps on the head, and phases of that study of the return of individuals or incarnation. They believed in reincarnation. Astrology, numerology, phrenology, and incarnation. It says they were from the teachings by Melchizedek and propagated by Elijah and Elisha and Samuel. They watched the signs of the times. They watched the heavens and the astrological cycles. And it says here, the North Star, in its variation, made for those cycles that would be in coordinate with those changes that had been determined by some. This began the preparation for 300 years. When they saw the change in the North Star in relation to the southern clouds, it says, or that position of the polar star or North Star as related to the southern clouds, when this was seen, it was determined that the new cycle had begun. Remember the reading about the Great Pyramid in this time? And it said in 1932 in the fall, if you could draw imaginary lines from the entrance of the Great Pyramid to the polar star, there would begin to be a variation. This was the beginning of the preparation period of the new race in this time. And this, back in the Piscean age, again, the polar star is the key that tells them there is a new cycle beginning. So they begin to prepare. Now these people are not Orthodox, and they are persecuted by the Orthodox. It says, these have been persecuted by those of the leaders, and so they set themselves apart from the other groups. Now I want to tell you something about the other groups, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, what they believed in. I remember that Dr. Puryear mentioned the Pharisees last night. The Pharisees believed in a resurrection. That's the term they used for reincarnation at that time. And they believed in ministering spirits and angels. And they were traditionalists and strict adherents of the Mosaic law and interpreters of it. And they believed in national independence, but they weren't fanatical like the Zealots, who actively fought to overtake or overcome the government, the Romans, overthrow them. But they sort of held to themselves, stayed to themselves. Now the Sadducees, on the other hand, did not believe in the resurrection. And they did not believe in spirits or ministering angels, and politically, generally, they were in favor of the Romans. They would just kind of go along, fair weather friends, you know, well, okay, the Romans are here, we'll cooperate. And it says the aristocratic Sadducees became more and more the party of the priesthood. Almost every high priest was drawn from its ranks for about 200 years. So these were the groups, traditional groups at this period. And, of course, Jesus called them vipers and looking for a sign, always. Looking, show us a sign, if you're who you say are. Do something. Do a miracle. Of course, he did miracles all over the place. They didn't accept that. There is one person here called Durcon. Durcon sounds like a masculine name to me, but this was, in this life, a female. It doesn't say whether she was a male at that time. But it says she was of the Essenes and the influence that made the whole ideal and idea possible. Now this person only had one reading here. There was no follow-up on it, nothing. But this is an important reading because of the principles involved here. It says, for the entity gained from the teachings of many, outside the pale of the tenets of the Mosaic law, those things that were good in the purifying of the body, not only through the mastering of activities in thought, but through the diet and through the communion with the universal forces as manifested in nature. You see what they're saying here? The same principles that Rata used in his temples, exactly the same, outside the pale of the Mosaic law. These tenets, purifying the body, the mind, working with the diet, and communing within meditation. This Durcon, who was responsible for this. And it says, when they went into the order, they not only studied the astrology, numerology, phrenology, and incarnation, Their life and works during these periods of preparation for the new race, to be channels for the new race, were given to alms, good deeds, missionary activities. I think it's interesting that they used the term the new race. Back in Rata's time, when they were cleansing the bodies, he was preparing the women, the fathers, to be channels for the new race, purifying the body and the mind. In the Piscean age, preparing for the master, what are they doing? Preparing for the new age and the new race, purifying the bodies and the minds. What are we doing now? Again, they mention the new race in this period. We, too, who believe, must prepare in body and in mind. Now, I'll be talking about the coming of the Christ, and this, as Herb has pointed out so beautifully, is a personal coming as well as a physical coming, but I'll give you the readings on that tonight. But these Essenes were preparing and expecting for this promised one. Now, it describes a secret meeting. They had secret meetings along the way. See, they were persecuted, remember, by these other groups, and so they had to do this in the quiet. It says, please describe a secret Essene meeting before Christ, at which Judy, the leader of the Essenes at Carmel, and others were present. And it says, the Essenes were a group of individuals sincere in their purposes, and yet not orthodox. The meeting would be described by the meditations, certain ritualistic formulas. And it says here, such a meeting, they would interpret each of the promises that had been made as to when and as to how there would come the promised one, according to the scriptures, from Genesis to Malachi. And it said they would take turns leading these discussions in their groups. It sounds very much like a Search for God group. Think, old Essene meetings, we don't have to slip around anymore. We can do them in public. And coming together, discussing religious subjects, searching for God within ourselves, rotating the leadership sometimes. Sounds similar. Now, the Essenes were those who believed in psychic experiences. They had dreams and they had visions, and these were recorded and handed down, rather, traditionally within their groups. And they would be told the various visions and dreams. Now, there was one person, Phineas, and his companion. It said they both received the experience similar to that by Hannah. They knew that they were to have a special child set apart for this. And so they dedicated themselves in this group. And it said, when Judy was born, everybody was surprised, and some were disturbed that it was a girl, not a boy, as expected. Some confusion, it says, in the minds of many. Now, the point was made here. The reason she was a girl is to show the equality of men and women. That was one of the basic teachings of the Essenes at that time that was not practiced in the Orthodox groups, that men and women were equal and given equal rights. And so this promised one was a little girl. Now, Judy was brought up in this community, and it says brought up in that environment, not of disputations or arguments, but rather that as of rote and writ. And it says much had been in that period tradition rather than record, appeared to her to be very important. She was impressed that these visions, these psychic experiences and dreams were just carried down through tradition and not really recorded. She determined to record these special events and dreams and so forth. And so it was that Judy became the prophetess, the healer, the writer, the recorder for these groups. And it says that, why was Judy not, well, I've told you why she's not a boy, to show the equality of men and women. Now, Judy is important not only because she's in charge of the Essenes at Carmel, but she determined what Jesus would study. She became his teacher. And she taught him personally with some of the priests from the years 12 to about 16. And then she determined where he would go to study after that, when he went on his travels. So she's a very important figure during this time. I'll tell you more of Jesus' studies tonight when we talk about Egypt as the foundation of Christianity. Now, Judy in the present time, this day and time, was here at the ARE. I met her, knew her in the earlier days when I first came here. And she used to speak for the ARE and write. She was a writer in the present time. And I had an interview with Hughlin Casey about this lady to tell me something about her life. For I didn't know her personally. I just saw her around, not knowing who she was at the time. I'm sure I would have followed a little closer had I known. And he says at one time during her life she had 2 plays on Broadway at once. 2. And at one time she managed the Empire State Tower in New York and had a radio program every day, a 15-minute interview with prominent people. She was something of an impresario. She used to promote people who were performing artists. And she had a newspaper column in 110 newspapers. Something of a writer and an influence in this world, in this time. I'd like to look at the correspondence of some of these people to Edgar Cayce and about their readings. Judy, when she would write to Edgar Cayce, would say, "Dear Rata." She always addressed him as Rata. Of course, she had an incarnation back during those days. I guess it impressed her very much. So she wrote to him one time, "Dear Rata," and then she was talking to him about different things, and then she told him an experience, and this is it. She said she was not feeling well one day, and she was at her desk working, and in came a deaf mute, a young boy, around 16, and she had no idea how he got past her secretary, but in he came, and he had a little card with him that she could read. He was selling some pads and pencils. And so she read the card, and she bought a pad and a pencil, put it down, and resumed her work. And the boy walked to the door, and he turned back, and he looked at her, and he wrote something on a pad and held it up. And she was very ill that day. He held it up, and it said, "Be well." And he smiled and left. She said at that moment she was well. She was healed instantly. And she says to him, "I thought no more about it." Let's see. "Furthermore, I believe the Christ was in my office that morning, made manifest through this dear afflicted child who could not heal himself, but who left the Christ with me in healing blessing." You may believe, whenever I see a deaf mute today, I buy whatever he's selling. Now, they were preparing channels for the new race at Carmel. Zechariah was a priest, an Orthodox Jewish priest, who was married to Elizabeth, who became the mother of the forerunner. Elizabeth was an Essene, Zachariah not. Now, they were well along in years at this time. And Zachariah went in to perform his services at the altar. And at that time, Gabriel appeared to him. He went in to offer incense. And Gabriel said to him, this is a slight paraphrase, of course, you understand, from the ancient Aramaic text. And it says, Zachariah, Elizabeth is going to bear a child who will have the Holy Spirit in him from his birth. And Zachariah paused a moment and said, well, I'm pretty old, and Elizabeth is certainly too old to have a child. This can't be. Now, let me tell you something. Whenever those archangels come to you, right from the throne of God, don't you mess around with them. You say, right on. Whatever you say, I'm with you. Because he doubted the word of God. It says he was struck dumb. And the angel said, for this you shall not speak another word until this child is born. And he was in there so long, they were wondering what in the world has happened to Zechariah at the altar offering the incense. And he came out, and of course he could say nothing. And there he was, until this child was born. Now when John was born, and he said his name is to be John. All right. They take the child to be circumcised. And so they ask during the ceremony, what is the name of the child? They ask the mother, because the father can't speak. And so the mother said, his name is John. And they look at each other because they know nobody in their lineage is named John, and this is not the tradition. You must name the child after some relative. And so they look at her, and then they think, well, we've got to ask Zechariah. Zechariah, what is the child's name? And he motions for a tablet, and he writes down, the child's name is John. And at that moment, he could speak. And so it was that the forerunner was born, an Essene. Now, after Mary's visit to Elizabeth, the brotherhood began to prepare those dedicated women who would aid in the care and teaching of those special children, Jesus and John. This was the tradition of the Essenes, that these special children would have certain nursemaids or those to care for them within the family unit. And so there was one who took care of the painting and touching up around the temple, whose name was Sophia. And Sophia went to Zechariah, and she said, Zechariah, I would like to be the nursemaid of John, your child. But she said, would you please determine this through the Urim and Thummim? And let me tell you about the Urim and Thummim. They were small sacred objects placed in the breastplate of the high priest. As a form of divination by lot, they were used. And it said to ascertain divine will. They were probably two small stones. Their exact nature and use is unknown. If a question of guilt was raised, the answer was apparently by Urim. If innocent, the answer was by Thummim. And the stone may have become divinely illuminated or such as that. Now, she wanted there to be no argument or no question in the minds of people about her being the nursemaid of John. So would he please find out if she was to be the one through the Urim and Thummim? And so he did this, and it was determined that she indeed was to be the maid of John. So this made Sophia very happy. She lived in the household with them. And it says, after she had lived there for 6 years, she went then into the household of Mary and Joseph. And Jesus and taught the cousin about his cousin, John. Taught Jesus about John and his purpose when he was a little boy. Interesting. It says here, then the entity was associated with Jesus with the last year of the experience in the household of Mary and Joseph. The entity was especially given this office to indicate to the developing child the nature, the character of the cousin. Now, Zechariah believed in these promises that his son was special and that the Messiah was coming. And he talked about it, I guess, a little too freely. For it says the Romans robbed Elizabeth of her mate through the death, even at the altar. They were very edgy when anybody would talk about a power arising other than their own. Very edgy. And so Zechariah was slain even at the altar. Now, being persecuted not only by the Romans but the other sects, some of the followers of Jesus had this in common. As I mentioned to you the first night we met, it says the combination of certain vowels were used by his followers to warn others as to the approach of danger. And so when danger was imminent and they wanted to warn others, they would just break out into this kind of a chant as a warning. And then it says, as a carryover for this woman, Marian, the songs of Galilee, or the rugged cross, as well as the sounding of certain vowels, arouse much in the inner self of the entity. We know, through our experiences already this week, that music and song can stimulate memories within us, touch those memories. And when we sing certain songs or hear certain music, these experiences come forth once again. And so it was with her. As to the choosing of Mary, it says here that women and men could enter this order, and they offered themselves in general services. Now, there is a correlation that I want to make between the Essenes at this point and what Rata did in the Temple Beautiful. When you went into the Temple Beautiful, you went in to be prepared in certain ways for which you could best serve. When you first entered the Essenes, you went into what was called general services. And then if they saw your abilities in certain directions, then you were trained in special services at various times. Interesting correlation. And of course, they were working on the cleansings for channels for the new race. It says these were set aside for preserving themselves in direct line of choice for the offering of themselves as channels through which there might come the new or the divine origin. And their life and their works during this period were given to alms and good deeds and missionary activities, as I have mentioned. Now, Anne presented her little child to the Essene group when she was quite young, only a few years old. And she claimed that this child was born without her knowing man. And it said this caused a dispute within the Essene group at Carmel. Some could accept this and some could not. And so there was a kind of a break there and much dissension and discussion. And some did not want to accept this child because of her claim. But this little child, Mary, was so perfect, it said, in mind and body, that they really couldn't refuse her. They had to take her. So they accepted her. And it said, thus came the division, yet others were chosen, such as a representation of the 12 in the various phases that had been or that had made up Israel or man. So 12 little girls were chosen. As to their training, now here we have a very direct correlation with the Egyptian period. As to their training, so describe the training and preparation. And it said trained as to physical exercise first, preparing the body itself. Trained as to mental exercises as related to chastity, purity, love, patience, endurance. And it said all of these by what would be termed by many in the present as persecutions, but as tests for physical and mental strength. And then the protection in the food values. And they said, what were the special diets? And he said, no wine, no fermented drink ever. Special foods, yes. These were kept balanced according to that which had been first set by Aaron. There's a question mark there. She's not sure what that name was. Something that sounded like Aaron. And guess who? Rata. The diet set by Aaron and Rata. And what was the basic diet of the Atlanteans and the Egyptians? Figs, dates, and cornmeal, otherwise known as mummy food. Right there at Carmel. Yes, indeed. And so it was a very strict training program, and I'm sure that it followed closely in that used in Egypt, a very strict training program as to the body, preparing the body, and discipline of the mind as to chastity and purity and the fruits of the Spirit. All of this. Now it says, there was the prophecy among the Essenes that an angel would designate the one to be the channel of the promised one. An angel would tell them. See, they're psychic. A lot of psychics here at this group at Carmel. And it said Mary was between 12 and 13 when designated as the chosen one by the angel on the stair. And this is the description, a beautiful description of that choosing. The temple steps are those that led to the altar. These were called the temple steps. These were those upon which the sun shone as it arose of a morning, when there were the first periods of the chosen maidens going to the altar for prayer, as well as for the burning of the incense. On this day, as they mounted the steps, all were bathed in the morning sun, which was not only made a beautiful picture, but clothed all in a purple and gold. As Mary reached the top step, then, there were the thunder and lightning, and the angel led the way, taking the child by the hand before the altar. This was the manner of choice. This was the showing of the way, for she led the others on this particular day. And then they knew she was the one. It says here, how many of you are Aquarians? Well, listen up here. Aquarians. It says, remember thou art in the same signs, omens, as the mother of him that gave to the earth the physical man, Jesus, Aquarius, in its perception, perfection. How about that? That make you feel good, Aquarians? I don't know how it makes the rest of us feel, but we'll look up to you. And it says here, another correlation with Egypt. They were preparing channels for pure offspring. We still had contaminations back in Egypt, 10,500 BC. And now, what are they doing here? They're taking this channel to the utmost of purity and perfection. Not only do they have an Immaculate Conception with Mary, but Jesus is immaculately conceived of an immaculately conceived mother. And so we have a very pure channel. And I think all of this stemmed from way back, the preparations in Egypt for this. That was the background. As to the Immaculate Conception, let me read you a little bit. And as two souls come in a union of purpose, Now this is for you and for me, for us during this day and time. Not a gratifying of earth, not a gratifying of earthly impulses and desires, but that they too may be used as channels through which souls may enter. There may be brought into the earth those that may quicken, for all must be lifted up, even as he. Does this mean that the world will evolve into bringing souls into the world in the manner that Mary did? Souls will evolve into the manner to be able to bring souls into the earth, even as Mary did. And these may come as the souls of men and women become more and more aware that these channels, these temples of the body, are indeed the temple of the living God, and may be used for those communications with God, the Father, the souls of men. As we attune ourselves, I think it's saying here, more and more to become aware of God. God is in us and all around us. And as we communicate with him, as like Aunt Belle said last night, talk to God daily. Talk with him as though he's right here with us, for he is indeed. And to talk to him as his child, as we do this more and more, become more in tune, as we enter into relationships, sexual relationships with our partners, not just to fulfill a physical desire, but as a purpose of being a channel for a spiritual soul, more and more, closer and closer, will we come to this being able to manifest a soul as Mary did. But we have work to do before we can come to that point. And again, the preparation by Rata, the preparing those people to be channels. What did they do? Oh my goodness, they played music. They raised the consciousness. They even played beautiful music and intonations and so forth during periods of conception to bring in, to raise the consciousness, even at that moment, to bring in a more spiritual soul.